You can beat insulin resistance. That's right, reversal of insulin resistance without having to spend a ton of money on supplements, potions, and elixirs and all sorts of crazy stuff out there. Look, I have a clinic right now with medical practitioners, and we do this very successfully. Insulin resistance is a condition that will get worse over time. So quit wasting time and handle that resistance before you continue to progress and develop obesity and diabetes. Okay, so what exactly is insulin resistance? In order to understand what insulin resistance is, we have to first look at healthy sugar function and metabolism in the body. So when we eat food, blood sugar rises. Now, when we look at different macronutrients of food, the different sources of calories, we got fat, we got protein, we got carbohydrates. Fat really doesn't raise blood sugar that much. Protein does to a certain extent, and carbohydrates are the highest source of blood sugar rising. Most of us are going to have at least protein, if not carbohydrates, in our meals. And so every time we eat, blood sugar rises. So we eat, blood sugar rises. The body detects blood sugar rising and it releases insulin. Insulin is a hormone that's responsible for getting the sugar out of your blood and driving it into the cells. And it's very powerful and very good at doing just that. So you eat, blood sugar rises, insulin rises, blood sugar lowers, insulin lowers. Even if you ate a ton of crappy food, high sugar food, and you have a very large spike in blood sugar, a healthy body will then bring that down with insulin. So we call that a transient rise in blood sugar. And that transient rise in blood sugar is completely normal and part of healthy physiology, right? It's when that blood sugar stays chronically elevated, which we're going to get to here in a little bit. So we understand healthy functioning of sugar and insulin's effect on keeping it in check. Resistance now is a condition where insulin cannot get the job done as effectively, right? So you have trillions of cells in your body, and each cell, by the way, has about 10,000 receptor sites for insulin. So you do the math on that one. There's a lot of insulin and insulin receptor mechanisms of actions taking place. And think of it like a key going into a door to open the door, unlock it so that the glucose, the sugar, can get into the cell, right? That's what insulin does. But when the resistance sets in, right, now the keys are not opening the doors as well, right? It takes multiple keys. It takes multiple molecules of insulin, right? So insulin resistance, literally, your body's not responding to insulin as well. And so the result of that is your body has to produce more insulin in order to get the job done. So now we have, and for many people, the first time ever, a situation with the body where the body is releasing insulin no longer in reaction to just what you're eating, but because insulin has to be elevated in order to get the sugar out of your blood and into your cells. Not a great place to be, because blood sugar is very destructive, and this is why diabetes is such a concerning condition, because late stage, I mean, we see what happens to diabetics all the time. It's freaking scary. You can go blind, glaucoma, you can lose limbs, you can lose toes because the circulation is so bad, erectile dysfunction, neuropathy, weight gain. All these issues happen from diabetes, a condition that starts with insulin resistance, okay? But when you are still insulin resistant, right, and not diabetic yet, your blood sugar is still in check. That's the big difference, which I think is important to understand. Diabetes is a condition where your blood sugar is no longer able to, your body's no longer able to regulate your blood sugar. It's with its own internal systems, which we just talked about, right? And so now you need medications and eventually insulin. Insulin resistance is that precondition where your body's still fighting, it's still battling, your blood sugar still looks good, but meanwhile, the resistance is setting in and developing and getting worse and worse and worse. So why did that resistance develop to begin with? And there are multiple theories and multiple ideas as to why insulin resistance develops. And one of the biggest theories, I would say the one that to me makes the most amount of sense and seems to be the answer, because we literally operate off of that and patients get better. Because remember, I have clinics that are doing this all the time with patients, is this idea of chronically elevated insulin levels, right? Chronically elevated insulin levels are going to be the thing that drives the resistance. And this is very common outside of the insulin mechanism and resistance that develops in bodies. I mean, think of a wild example, cocaine, a crazy drug that has a powerful stimulating effect. Within 1 to 2 uses of it, an individual would need more of that cocaine in order to get the same effect, right? You ever heard of antibiotics and antibiotic resistance, right? Because we are overprescribing antibiotics, there are now resistances that are developing to various antibiotics, which is a whole other problem in of itself. So this sort of resistance that bodies develop is a very common thing that your body does to sort of maintain homeostasis, to maintain balance, right? If you have too much of one thing, well, let me make you more resistant to it, right? It's always trying to do this thing because it's, again, the human body is a very intelligent design, a very intelligent mechanism, and it's always trying to do the most efficient thing and most effective thing that it possibly can. Okay, so chronically elevated insulin levels. Well, how did that start? Where did this massive problem of chronically elevated insulin levels start? Because if you look at these charts right here on obesity and diabetes, you can see the just marked increase in diabetes and obesity, first in the 70s with obesity, and then after that, about 10 years later with diabetes. So this is a huge problem right now that unfortunately is getting worse before it's getting a lot better. And I truthfully believe that at its core is chronically elevated insulin levels. And it makes a lot of sense when I take you through a little history lesson, guys. So let's dive into that. All right. So prior to the 1950s, right, we were, and when I say we, doctors, literature, researchers, we understood that the solution for obesity and diabetes was eat less processed carbs. Just ask your parents or your grandparents. It was pretty well understood that excessive consumption of processed carbohydrates was the thing. And so you stop eating those or eat less and you're going to lose weight and help your diabetes, help your blood sugar issues. But then something changed in about the 1950s. Okay. So in about the 1950s, we started noticing an increase in death due to heart disease, right? And so this is a big deal. So naturally, researchers are trying to figure this out, trying to figure out what exactly is going on and why more people are dying from heart disease. And there was some idea, there was some research that came out that made it seem or made it appear to be that maybe it was fat, maybe it was cholesterol, specifically saturated fat, and cholesterol was the culprit. Although it wasn't sound literature and it wasn't really considered fact yet. So between the 50s and 70s ensued this massive debate, all right? So this debate existed where we had proponents of the, yes, it's saturated fat and cholesterol, we got to eat less of that. And the other side of the argument was, no, it's not, it's something else, okay? Little did we know, which we understand now, at that time, we had improvements in public health measures, improvements in medicine overall, vaccinations, and antibiotics. So death due to infections, specifically a big one, tuberculosis, was just decreasing on a massive level, right? A lot less people were dying due to infection. And so with less deaths due to infection means more deaths to whatever's next in line. That's just the way it works because a certain amount of people are all going to die eventually. And so we didn't make that connection back then. And so we were trying really hard to find the culprit. And so this debate ensued, right? And unfortunately, something pretty crazy happened in 1977, right? This marks the first time in history where our big brother stepped in, the government stepped in and made a decision for us regarding our health. And, you know, I could get behind this if maybe there was some sort of powerful or stronger evidence of some sort showing us that, okay, we're pretty confident here, right? And so the government's like, I just got to make a decision. Okay, great. But we didn't have that. So some individuals in government sat down together and met and made this decision. And like that, all of a sudden, there became the development of the food pyramid. You guys remember this food pyramid? Let me know in the comments if you remember, because I sure as heck do remember being educated about this food pyramid. And what's at the nice core base of this food pyramid? Say it with me, everybody. Carbohydrates. Okay, remember, there are only 3 sources of calories: fat, protein, and carbohydrates. And fat is a very calorically dense macronutrient. And so if you make this massive attempt to decrease, which is what they did after this decision that cholesterol and saturated fat was bad, they made this massive movement and this massive shift with education, with the food that they fed kids, and very effectively changed history and got us to eat less fat and less cholesterol. Well, that means that there's going to be an increase in the consumption of protein and carbohydrates. You can only eat so much protein, which is why, and protein's expensive, which is why we landed on the food pyramid, which they have always told us 60%, get your whole grains in, guys. 60% oats, fiber, whole grains. And they did say fruits and vegetables are still great. I don't have a problem with fruits and vegetables. I have a problem with the excessive consumption of carbohydrates. 60% is way too much. So the food pyramid, unfortunately, has been what we've all been told and led to believe is the ideal representation of macronutrients. And unfortunately, a lot of people as of today still think this is the way to approach food. So, and again, I always say this, from a scientific perspective, correlation does not mean causation. So I'm not trying to say this is the reason why insulin resistance is purely a situation of chronically elevated insulin levels. I'm just trying to point facts and come up with the best solution we possibly can. And I find it very interesting and very plausible that when we see this massive spike in obesity and massive spike in diabetes, pretty much right after we made this massive shift in our dietary approaches and understanding, and we effectively did that. And so again, that connection to me is very, very convincing among everything else that we're going to get into in this video and everything else that I do as far as operating with patients and helping them to heal and beat this insulin resistance and obesity issue. All right. So what are the effects of insulin resistance? Well, we talked about the obvious one, diabetes. That's a big one. Okay. The resistance is your body's battle against those elevated blood sugar levels, right? The excessive consumption of carbohydrates, the lack of burning it, your body's trying to store it, blood sugar is rising, so your body is trying to beat it by releasing more and more insulin. Then the resistance develops, and now we need more insulin just because the insulin's not doing as good of a job. At some point, right, your body can no longer release more insulin on its own to get the job done. And that's where you start to become pre-diabetic and diabetic because the blood sugar has no ability on the body's own right to go down. And so now you go down that pathway of medication. And first it's metformin, and then it's a lot more metformin, and then it's sulfonylureas usually, and then it's more sulfonylureas, and then there's a couple situational medications that they use, maybe some GLP-1s. And then eventually a patient keeps progressing because insulin resistance is progressive. And they get to a point where now they need insulin. First it's a very little bit of insulin, and then it's more insulin, and then it's more insulin. This is why the entire healthcare system operates off this idea that diabetes is a chronically irreversible disease. Yet you go to the American Diabetes Association website in 2019, and they released the criteria for diabetes remission. Do I think reversing diabetes is easy? Not at all, right? It's much easier to beat it at the insulin resistance phase, but we help people with diabetes all the time beat it. And we're going to get into those mechanisms of how we actually do that later on in this video. So we have to really understand what is going on here. So diabetes, one huge long-term effect. The next one is weight gain, right? If you ever heard of a book called The Obesity Code, Dr. Jason Fung really laid the foundation for us. He's got a book called The Diabetes Code. He's actually got two more, the PCOS Code and the Cancer Code. Really awesome books that really paved the way for a better understanding. It's still up for debate whether the hormonal basis of obesity is actually the real thing that's going on. And I look forward to more and more research that it continues to expand our understanding. I have actually several videos where I get into that specifically, but nonetheless, it is definitely working for us because we focus on that with our patients. So weight gain is an inevitable side effect and consequence of being insulin resistant because we are likely going to be consuming more calories as we are insulin resistant. Our bodies is not going to function the same way that it would if it wasn't resistant in terms of its ability to regulate its own body weight. So higher levels of hunger, higher levels of food chatter. And we all know and see and have heard with the excitement with these weight loss medications called semaglutide and tirzepatide, what food chatter really is, appreciation for it, and appreciation for what those medications can do in terms of removing it, but just what that does and why chronically elevated insulin levels and insulin resistance will ultimately lead us down that path of weight gain. So we got diabetes, we got weight gain, we got these ugly skin tags and discolorations, we got abdominal fat, we got lower levels of energy, and it goes on, guys. So insulin resistance is definitely something, again, I'm going to say this multiple times, you can beat it. I will educate you further on in this video, but it does help understanding how it developed so that we can understand why the treatment's so effective. One more aspect to understand of what contributes to the development of insulin resistance is inflammation. Inflammation in its own right, and I'll have separate videos talking about inflammation, but inflammation in its own right will cause an effect of weight gain. So independent of insulin, inflammation will promote more of a fat storage effect, and it will promote more of a fat, it'll block the fat mobilization and fat burning effect. And the more body fat that we have, the more inflammation that we are producing, because body fat is actually part of an endocrine system, the endocrine system, and it is a pro-inflammatory tissue most of the time. And so more body fat means more inflammation means more body fat, unfortunately. So insulin resistance and inflammation are, to me, the big culprits. There's, again, some other theories. Saturated fat is a big one, and there is some data that says excessive consumption of saturated fat can lead to insulin resistance, but you shouldn't be consuming excessive amounts of saturated fats anyways. I don't know who's advocating that, and we're going to talk about keto and how to avoid that here in a little bit.
Quick minute here. I wanted to tell you guys about my free resources to help you guys with your sustainable weight loss goals. I have a free Facebook community where I do weekly live coaching. It's all about helping you hit your goals and maintain your weight for the rest of your life. And I also have a free PDF where I break down step by step exactly what it takes for you to be successful. I'll put a link to this in the show, and we'll see you guys back in the show.
All right. So how do we beat insulin resistance? All right. So at this point, you should be able to parrot this information off for me, right? What causes insulin resistance? Chronically elevated insulin levels. What causes chronically elevated insulin levels? A diet consisting of excessive amounts of foods that are going to have the highest effect on spiking insulin, right? And what are those foods? Primarily within the carbohydrate category, but specifically sugar, processed foods, foods where they got rid of the fiber, where they processed it, they removed a lot of the nutrients, they removed a lot of the things that would slow down the absorption, slow down the spike in blood sugar. So sugar and processed foods, high fructose corn syrup, which is a processing of fructose. There is a lot of controversy over whether fructose itself is bad, and I have my own opinions on that I'll talk about in other videos, but we can certainly say high fructose corn syrup, which is commonly found in sodas and candies and processed sweets, is definitely bad, is definitely going to spike insulin levels very high and contribute to this pathway, right? So those foods are going to be the culprit. But in general, though, protein still raises the insulin levels, as even fat a little bit too as well, right? So what is the best method of doing the opposite of eating those foods? It's going to be a bit of a trick question. I want you guys to think about that. What is the opposite of eating foods? Can you say it with me? Fasting. So fasting is a very powerful intervention. Now, technically speaking, you can just stop eating those processed foods and not fast, right? And you're going to have some very powerful impact on your blood sugar. But what is going to be the most powerful impact to blood sugar dietary-wise? It would be simply to stop eating. When you stop eating, there is nothing more powerful in terms of diet that you can do, right? The absence of all food is the most powerful. I call it a food-related intervention because technically it is, because you're choosing to not eat anything, right? But it gets a little confusing when you think about that, but it is a dietary intervention. It's the absence of eating. And so fasting is the most powerful effect to do the opposite of raising blood sugar. Fasting in of itself lowers blood sugar because eventually your blood sugar will lower as your body is utilizing that blood sugar and you're not contributing more to it, right? So fasting will lower blood sugar. Now, intermittent is the style of fasting that many of you guys have heard of and know a lot about. And I have plenty of other videos talking about intermittent fasting and prolonged fasting, so I won't go too far into it. But intermittent is your daily shortened eating window of fasting, like basically 8 hours, right? 6 to 8 hours, get all your calories within that, and then don't eat till the next window of eating the following day. I'm going to be honest with you guys. For most of you watching this, you got more than 20 pounds settled in, you got insulin resistance, intermittent fasting is not going to cut it. That's just plain and simple. It's a great intervention. It's a phenomenal tool to staying healthy. But when you already have the dysregulation, when you already have the resistance in and you're overweight, you got to do something more aggressive. And that's where we get on to prolonged fasting. So prolonged fasting is simply the increase beyond, and there's no real technical definition. 24 hours seems to be where I land on and where I see most people reference. 24 hours or longer would be considered a prolonged fast, right? Now, what we do with our patients, I created the FLOW protocol, FLOA, fasting like our ancestors. So the FLOW protocol is the world's most aggressive fasting regimen. We work with our patients with various means and medications and peptides and supplements. And it's not just me. I just do the coaching. My medical practitioners do the prescriptions, but we work together, which is nice. Our goal for our patients is to get them to a weekly long fast, somewhere between 36 to 48 hours every single week. Think about that for a second. A 48-hour fast is amazing. And even today, as of making this video, your fasting experts will say maybe do that once a month, which is still very aggressive to what other people would say. But thinking about it, doing it every single week. You want to beat this disease, you want to get the results, then you need to put in the work. Now, there is a ton of literature on fasting, and unfortunately, there is nowhere near enough. And I am excited and look forward to the days as prolonged fasting, specifically literature, expands and grows. And I'm hoping the stuff that we're doing with patients one day may be part of those studies. So, but what we're operating off of here as well is also a little bit of ancestral wisdom, right? Because you think about it for a second, as crazy as that may sound to you, let's just take a step back and look at human history for a little bit, okay? Human beings have lasted, our earliest ancestors, 3 million years, right? For the majority of 3 million years, humans did not have steady states of food. In fact, it wasn't until about 10,000 years, which is a very small portion of 3 million, agricultural times happened, and now we had steady states of food, okay? So for the majority of 3 million years, our ancestors would go very frequently, infrequently, but frequently, infrequently, if you know what I mean, they would be forced to not eat because they ate what they killed and hunted and secured, and they had to hunt again, right? Very much in line with the animal kingdom. Same thing with them, right? Which is currently going on now. So just from an evolutionary perspective, right? Everybody alive today, everybody watching this video, you are the result of 3 million years of evolution doing what it does. Our ancestors that couldn't survive, in theory, were the ones that couldn't survive those longer periods without food. So our bodies have developed these internal systems to be able to last through longer periods without food. One of them is the ability to slow down the metabolism, and that's what relates to the weight loss plateau. And I have a great video. I'll link to the weight loss plateau video at the end of this one. But aside from that, it's the ability to fast and still sustain the body's energy demands over a long period of time, right? We have a couple sources of fuel, carbohydrates and fat. Carbohydrates are the primary sources of fuel, and fat are going to be the long-term, long-sustaining energy. We only have about 18 to 24 hours on average, depending on how much muscle and how active the individual was, of energy that's stored in the form of carbohydrates. We call it glycogen, and that glycogen is stored in your liver and in your muscle tissue. After that, if you still haven't eaten, you are literally forcing the body to get its energy stores from your fat. Like it has no option, right? And so your body, believe me when I say this, was built to fast, right? We did not have enough time as human beings to evolve out of the mechanisms or evolve away from the mechanisms that 3 million years have led us to today, right? So really let that history lesson there sink in. and really understand that fasting is just a part of what the human body is capable of, and in my opinion, should be doing on a regular basis. Now, some of you might be asking, well, Dr. Jones, when I fast, especially for that long, I feel like crap. So whatever the case may be, some people will start a long fast and they'll feel great. Other people, they will feel really crummy. And if you think about it, I mean, it really makes sense, right? This is two different energy providing systems within the body. And if you've never used this system, right, it's going to be rusty. It's going to be out of shape. I tell patients sometimes, imagine you purchase a chainsaw 20 years ago and you pull it out and now you want to use it. Maybe it'll work. Maybe if you're lucky, it'll work great. And maybe it works clunky and maybe it doesn't work at all, right? Hence the variability of initial reactions from people when they embark on an intermittent or prolonged fasting journey, or our program, the Flow Protocol. But here's what I can tell you. Stick with it. Improve the overall health of your body and allow it to adapt and develop those systems. Those systems are already there. So maybe not developing is the best word, but train those systems, right? Just like weightlifting. If you've been lifting for a long time, do you remember how little you could lift? For example, if you're doing the chest press machine and you can press 200 pounds now, I certainly would argue that you probably were pressing 50 or 80 or 90, maybe 100 pounds. Like, you've made a huge leap in your strength, but it took time of you weightlifting. And remember, weightlifting is the literal tear down of muscle tissue. And that tear down, that stress, we know from weightlifting very, very all too well, that leads to a positive response of muscular hypertrophy. Fasting is the same thing to those fat burning systems, those systems within your body that'll produce ketones, which is the all too well known, talked about fuel source, which is what your body runs off of when it's in pure fat burning mode, right? And that's one of the awesome effects that we want to get to from long fasting, is the ability to make ketones. But in the beginning, when your body is first starting to do this, you're pushing through it, you're not going to produce as much ketones, and you're going to feel crummy potentially. And again, some of you might feel great.
I wanted to interrupt the show to tell you guys about the free resources that I have for you to be successful in 2024. The link in the show notes is going to provide you a way to join the free Facebook community. We do weekly live training. It's a great community. We'll answer all your questions with or without the medications. We're going to help you get there. And there's a free PDF which breaks down the steps so that you know exactly what to do, how to do it to be absolutely successful this year for your weight loss goals. Now back to the show.
Okay, so we talked about fasting and we talked about my approach towards fasting, the Flow Protocol. And by the way, my Flow Protocol encompasses everything that we're talking about here today. And so if you want to learn more about that, I'll link to our programs in the end notes there for you to check out. Ketogenic diet, low carb diet. Where does that fall into this equation? To me, this is the second most powerful intervention that you need to be doing to beat your insulin resistance. The 48-hour fast, if you can work up to that, is very, very powerful and will do a ton for allowing those receptor sites to heal. But what you eat on the other 5 days are also going to play a role. And truthfully, there's no easy way to measure how much effort in these things that I'm going to share with you, that I am sharing with you, that you need to do to beat this. So I'm just laying out the tools that I have found to be the most successful. We happen to do all of them with our patients and we get great results. So take that for what it is. But the next thing is a ketogenic diet. Now, the ketogenic diet, AKA the low carb diet, also known, history, we used to call it the Atkins diet, essentially is just getting your net carbs, your non-fibrous carbohydrates really, really low and consuming a lot more fat. This obviously is going to be a big deal, and it's going to contribute to lowering our chronically elevated insulin levels that we've described as a driving factor behind the development of insulin resistance, okay? So the low carb approach is definitely something that I would want you to incorporate as the second strategy, as the second tool. And with that, that doesn't mean a high protein diet. In fact, protein requirements really shouldn't change. They should be somewhere between 20-25% of your total calories, right? Another formula that I give my patients is whatever your target weight is, that's how many grams of protein you should be eating a day. So what you will be doing with a low carb diet is increasing your fat consumption. Now, this is an area of further research, and I look forward to seeing that. What is the best breakdown of fat consumption that you should be consuming or aiming for in a ketogenic diet, in a low carb diet? And for me, I keep it isocaloric. And what do I mean by that? We have 3 categories of fat. We have saturated, we have monosaturated, and we have polyunsaturated, right? This refers to the saturation of the hydrogens on the carbons, really, if that matters to you. But basically, they're different categories of fat. One quality of saturated is that it's solid at room temperature, okay? So we do know, and I mentioned that high amounts of saturated fat consumption is technically correlated and seen to potentially cause insulin resistance. So we never want to go high saturated. And I bring that up because when you go low carb and you go high fat, that is what can happen. And that does happen with a lot of people. They call that a dirty keto. So we want to avoid dirty keto, and we want to go for this clean keto approach, this clean low carb approach. But low saturated, I think, is also a concern because of all the amazing things that saturated fat does in terms of hormonal production is the big one that I think of. So this thirds is where I land on. 1/3 saturated, 1/3 polyunsaturated, and 1/3 monosaturated. But truthfully, for you watching this video, just think 1/3 saturated and 2/3 everything else, right? This category, unfortunately, is not big. Here are the majority of sources of poly and monounsaturated fats. You got olives, extra virgin olive oil, avocados, extra virgin avocado oil, nuts, all nuts, except I recommend the patients avoiding peanuts, generally speaking, and fish, small fish like mackerel, sardines, and salmon, delicious fatty fish. So that's it. There's not a ton of sources, even coconut oil, which you might have at this point have accepted the idea that coconut oil is very good for you. Technically speaking, coconut is still saturated. It's just a completely different type of saturated. They call it medium chain triglycerides, but nonetheless, that goes along with the rest of the yummy saturated fats, like all of our animal fats, all of our dairy, our cheese, all that stuff. We're never gonna underconsume that. So to make this easy, just focus on trying to get your fat source about 1/3 of it from that, and then 2/3 from everything else. Okay, so fasting, ketogenic diet. If you just did those 2 things, you are going to do wonders for your insulin resistance and even for your diabetes, guys. But I'll say this, if you are diabetic and you are watching this, I am not giving you medical advice, and you should always consult with your primary care physician upon starting dietary interventions like this if you are diabetic, especially where it does become tricky is if your resistance and diabetes has progressed to the point where you are taking medications. And the stronger the meds, especially insulin, the greater the potential of issues as you do begin to do things like low carb and fasting. So be sure to talk to your physician to make the best decision for you. Okay, so the third thing is reducing, and I've already kind of said this, but I'm going to say it again because it's important, reducing your consumption of processed foods. So processed foods, they have so many aspects about them that are bad. Like, I don't even know where to begin. They tend to be very high in sugar. And we talked about how bad sugar is. They tend to be high in additives and chemicals and preservatives. Toxicity is a whole nother category for a whole nother video. But toxicity is such a big deal that seems to be getting worse now that some people think that the real basis of obesity and issues and insulin resistance is toxicity exposure, endocrine disrupting chemicals. And I happen to believe that they do play a big role, and we should avoid as much toxic exposure as we can. But we should also focus on this side of it too as well. But I'm definitely continuing to research that. So the approach with processed foods is just reducing as much as you can. I always like to preach this 90-10 rule, okay? So 90% clean, 10% processed foods when you are actively trying to beat your insulin resistance, when you are actually trying to beat your diabetes or beat your weight problems. Just reduce your consumption of processed foods down to about 10%, 90-10, and then go low carb. If you did just that, you will do wonders as well. And then we talk about the fasting and along with the ketogenic approach. So we got fasting, we got keto, we got reducing consumption of processed foods. Finally, the last thing I want to touch on is resistance training. So resistance training is such a powerful intervention as well for helping with sugar metabolism, sugar physiology, and function. Your muscles act like sponges for glucose, right? I was talking to one of my mentors the other day, and we were discussing muscle and insulin sensitivity. Does building more muscle mass make you more insulin sensitive, or is the process of becoming more insulin sensitive allow you to build more muscle mass? And truthfully, we don't know, but we do know there's a strong relationship. The more muscle mass you have on your body, the more controlled your blood sugar will be, the more insulin sensitive you will be, aka the less insulin resistant you will be, and maintaining a healthy body weight, maintaining healthy blood sugar levels after you are able to wean off those medications, hopefully. And again, we can help you guys with that if you're looking to accomplish that. It's much more doable with the increased amount of lean body mass. Very powerful tissue to have on your body, muscle mass is, and we want to add it to our body. And especially if we're starting a weight loss program, we want to lift weights so that we can reduce the breakdown, because all weight loss is accompanied by some loss of lean body mass. And so lifting weights, consuming adequate protein is going to be the proper message to your body during weight loss to protect the degradation of lean muscle tissue. Okay, so I hope you learned a ton. I hope you've been armed with some great intel and some great information to help you beat this issue. I'm not saying the programs and the supplements and the things out there that cost a lot of money should be avoided. In fact, if you can afford them, and we're not talking about anyone specifically right now, they might help, and they very well could help, right? So, but for a lot of us, it's that financial barrier in front of us and the inability to purchase some of these things, and then thinking, well, if I can't do that, then I don't have any option to beat this, which is just not true. We have helped plenty of patients with very basic supplements, just some of the basic nutrition and supplements that would be recommended for anybody for overall health. And they implement these strategies and they do great, and their resistance gets better. So I want you to have more encouragement. I want you to have more positive outlook on this. And I want to let you know that I truthfully believe in your ability to do this. And if you are looking for some help, some structured approach, if you want to become one of our patients in the Flow Protocol program to help you beat your insulin resistance and your issues, and just so you know, whether it's PCOS, whether you're a woman in menopause, whether you are diabetic, we work with you and we have a successful format for doing that. So check that out. Get yourself scheduled for a consultation, guys. And as always, stay healthy out there.